They say the Tower of London still breathes, that in the early hours before dawn, beneath the cawing of ravens and the rattle of iron gates, you can hear whispers rising from the stones. Not screams, no, those fade. Whispers, the kind that once passed between men who wore crosses under their robes and daggers behind their backs. The kind of whispers that kill queens. A severed hand once lay in the grass beside the chapel, its fingers curled, still warm. It wore a velvet glove, pearl-stitched, the ring still on, a ring of marriage, a ring of power, a ring worn by Anne Boleyn. But the hand was not buried with the rest. This is not a story of romance, not a story of courtly love or tragic misunderstanding. It's a story of calculation, of fire masked as faith, of men who knelt not to their king, but to something older, darker, cloaked in incense and rot, than the glittering halls of Henry VIII's court. Beneath the laughter, the silk, the scripture there was a cult, a brotherhood sworn not to England, nor to the king, nor even to God, but to order. An order they believed Anne Boleyn had shattered. They called themselves Custodes Crucis, keepers of the cross, and they believed the queen was a heresy wrapped in flesh, a foreign tongue, a false womb, a curse wearing a crown. But Anne was not afraid. Not at first. She had danced in the courts of Europe, whispered French with a tongue sharpened by fire. She had captivated a king and twisted the path of a nation with her smile. She had made herself queen by sheer refusal to kneel. And for that, they would make her bleed, not in battle, not in debate, but in secret. They held their meetings beneath chapels, by candlelight and blood oath, men of cloth, of armor, of piety, of poison. They believed England had lost its soul when Henry tore from Rome, and the woman who lit the match had to be extinguished. But how do you kill a queen without leaving a trace of treason? You whisper, you wait, you turn love into suspicion, womb into failure, favor into curse. You turn the court against itself, and when the blade finally falls, it does not cry injustice. It breathes relief. Was it justice that killed her, or vengeance wearing the mask of holy duty? History will say she was tried for adultery, that she died by the sword, swiftly, cleanly. But history forgets the scent of conspiracy, the trembling hands of women who dressed her for the scaffold. The way her last prayer was not for salvation, but for silence, because she knew it was not the king who wanted her gone. It was the court that needed her dead, because she had become more than a woman. She had become a symbol, and symbols must be destroyed before they spread. What does it mean when faith becomes murder, when rituals mask revenge, when men who claim to serve God use him as a blade, when kings break with God? The knives do not fall from heaven. They are passed by human hands. So begins the story of Anne Boleyn's fall, not as a victim of lust or pride, but as a sacrifice carved by a cult that believed it was saving England's soul. But perhaps they were only feeding the fire, and the tower still remembers, even if we do not. Before the blood, before the blade, before the bone-chilling silence of the scaffold, there was light. Anne Boleyn entered the English court, not like a woman, but like a storm cloaked in velvet. She did not glide, she arrived. And with her came a new kind of danger, not the kind that screams, but the kind that smiles while moving the pieces of a kingdom. She was not bred for submission. France had taught her to speak with elegance and strike with precision. She carried books, not just rosaries. Her laughter was not gentle-lit, was sharp-edged, flirtatious, knowing. She moved through the court like a candle through a cathedral, lighting what had long remained hidden, and the men who had so long ruled with silent certainty could not look away. The king was the first to fall. Henry, bloated with ego, Rotting with dissatisfaction, saw in her something eternal. She was not just beautiful, she was different. She denied him, and in that denial, she became necessary. For a man who had everything, want was the rarest pleasure. Anne made herself the thing he could not have until she became the thing he could not live without. But her rise was not seduction, it was strategy. She refused his bed until he gave her a crown. She spoke of reform, of reason, of breaking Rome. She turned Henry's longing into a weapon and then pointed it at the Pope. Anne was not merely crowned, she was manifested, and with her, the world shifted. England tore itself from the Catholic Church. Henry declared himself head of a new religious order. Old priests wept, bishops tore their vestments, monasteries fell like carcasses in a feast. The Reformation was born in, it wore her colors. She gave speeches like a statesman. She read theology like a scholar. She debated bishops in their own tongue. She wore the crown with the ease of someone born to challenge the heavens. But power, when it wears a woman's face, unsettles the world. They began to whisper that she bewitched the king, that she hexed his heart, that her eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, held sorcery, that her extra fingernail was the mark of a witch, that she laughed too freely, that she knew too much. How do you destroy a woman who rules without armor? You call her unnatural. The court, once enchanted, grew uneasy. The nobles bowed, but their knees trembled. The old faith festered in corners, in cloisters, in hidden brotherhoods that saw and not as queen, but as disease. Still, she rose. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Teeny, red-haired, watching the world as if it owed her something, and still and stood, draped in gold, surrounded by poets and firebrands and fools who loved her for the world she was shaping. But behind the walls, something darker stirred. Every step she took into the light cast longer shadows behind her, because for every man she inspired, there was another who seethed. For every reform she sparked, a tradition turned to ash. For every prayer she spoke in English, a curse was muttered in Latin behind closed doors. Anne's brilliance did not make her safe. It made her blinding, and the longer she shone, the more desperate the shadows became to put her out. She was admired, desired, worshipped, but never forgiven, and in a world ruled by men terrified of magic they could not control. That was her greatest sin. She was a queen, born not from bloodline, but from defiance, and defiance always demands a reckoning, even if it must be disguised as righteousness. The crown gleamed on her head, but beneath it, her body betrayed her. The daughter she bore, though healthy and sharp-eyed, was not enough. Not for Henry, not for the court, not for the nation that hung its future on the fragile thread of a male. Ere Elizabeth's cry did not echo like triumph, it landed like a question. And from that moment, Anne's womb became not a vessel of promise, but a shrine of disappointment. The pressure twisted into her bones. With each month, she walked tighter, laughed less. Her hands fluttered often over her belly, as if coaxing a future into being. When the second pregnancy ended in loss, the midwives whispered of omens. When the third gave birth to a stillborn boy, pale, misshapen, barely human, they didn't whisper at all. They nodded. So prophecy had spoken. The court turned. So did the king. Henry, once enraptured, now recoiled. He blamed stress. He blamed her temper. He blamed God. But mostly, he blamed her. The woman who had unseated a queen and disrupted a church now could not produce a prince. Her beauty faded in his eyes. Her intellect, once thrilling, soured into arrogance. And in that crack between love and failure, something ancient crept in. The cult began to rise. The Custodes Crucis had waited in silence, in chapels and in cellars, nursing their outrage. Anne's miscarriages were not just medical, they were signs, divine warnings. Her bloodline, they claimed, was cursed. Her body, defiled by ambition, could not carry the future of England. They said her touch poisoned the king, a voice summoned spirits, her sex enslaved the will of men. But their plan was not to shout. It was deceit. They slipped into confessionals, into court gossip, into the ears of desperate lords and suspicious bishops. They penned anonymous letters, left symbols etched in wax beneath the queen's pillows. They bribed physicians to exaggerate her ailments, courtiers to echo their fears, and the queen, she felt it, in the way doors no longer opened as quickly, in the eyes that slid away when she entered, in the sudden, aching silence that followed her name. Still, she smiled. Still, she stood. But the light behind her eyes dimmed. 'Cause Anne knew perhaps better than Henry that her power had never truly come from her crown. It had come from potential, from the hope of a son. And now, that hope lay dead in a cloth-wrapped cradle no one dared name. Was this fate? Was it punishment? Was it simply the math of biology? Or was it sabotage? Some said the queen had been poisoned subtly, that her wine tasted strange, that her food no longer smelled quite right, that the cult had taken from her the only thing that shielded her, the future. But no one investigated, because when a queen fails to deliver, it is easier to let her fall than to ask why. This was the moment everything shifted, not with a scream, not with a strike, but with a stillborn sigh. Cow born dead. A king's eyes turned cold. A shadowed brotherhood beginning to rise from their knees. The miracle queen had become a barren vessel, and in the eyes of the court, it's a threat unworthy of survival. The halls of Whitehall echoed differently now, not with music or laughter, but with the hush of careful footsteps. Anne still wore her crown, but its weight had changed, no longer the weight of triumph, but of suspicion. And suspicion does not scream, it slithers, it listens. The courtiers bowed, but not with reverence. The servants curtsied, but watched her from the corners of their eyes. Her allies, once bold, now avoided her gaze. And behind the walls, behind the gilded altars and stained glass saints, the Custodes Crucis began to move. There were priests and knights, confessors and clerks, men who had pledged themselves to the sacred order long before Anne arrived, long before Henry declared himself God's voice in England. They had survived the fall of Rome's grip. They had not forgotten it. In their minds, Anne was the rupture, the harlot who led the king to apostasy, the foreign enchantress who turned altars to ash and put a bastard daughter in place of prophecy. They whispered of divine vengeance, but what they planned was far more human. They gathered in crypts beneath the palace chapels, hands bloodied from self-flagellation, eyes wild with doctrine. They studied ancient rites. They read revelations, not as metaphor, but as instruction. Anne was not just a threat. She was an abomination, and abominations must be purged. Their infiltration was almost complete. A confessor in her inner circle, a physician who monitored her bleeding, a lady-in-waiting who reported her every sigh. Even her brother George Boleyn was not beyond reach. He was watched, weighed, marked for judgment. Anne felt the walls closing in. She began waking in the night, her breath caught in her throat. Time, a raven's wing, stuffed beneath her pillow. The king had grown colder. He met with Cromwell more often. I asked questions. Where had Anne been? Who had she spoken to? Why did she laugh so much when alone? And once, she found a symbol etched beneath her prayer book, a crucifix inverted, ringed in ash. Other, till the cult worked, not to strike her, but to prepare the world to accept her fall. They orchestrated glances, paused conversations, manufactured rumors. They cast a net not to catch her, but to make the court believe she had drowned already. Was this treason, or a higher loyalty, disguised as heresy? Because for the Custodes Crucis, law was irrelevant. The king's justice was shallow. True justice belonged to God, and God, they believed, had no place for Anne Boleyn. She still walked with her chin high, her gowns rich, her voice sharp, but her footsteps slowed. Her letters grew shorter. Hands trembled when she touched Elizabeth's cradle, 'cause Anne was no fool. She knew the smell of conspiracy. She had worn it like perfume once. It burned. They say she began to speak less, that she wept at the altar alone, that her eyes followed shadows where none moved. The court watched the queen unravel, but behind that unraveling was design, and in the silent corridors of power, cult that called itself holy was tightening the noose knot with rope, but with belief. Soon the queen would fall, not by force, but by consensus, because when everyone believes a woman is cursed, her death feels like deliverance. Her body, once the vessel of England's hope, became its battlefield. Anne Boleyn bled for days. After the stillborn boy, she did not rise from her bed. Her skin, once kissed by candlelight, turned pale as wax. Her hands, once graceful with prayer and gesture, clenched and unclenched like broken wings. And the blood, it would not stop. They whispered it was a sign that the boy had been born deformed, marked by the devil, that his chest caved inward and his limbs twisted unnaturally, that he had no eyes, that he hissed instead of cried. These were lies, perhaps, but lies told often enough become truth in a court that craves symbols. Anne's womb became prophecy, proof that God had turned his face. Her enemies said she had bewitched the king, and now God had claimed what was rightfully his. The Custodes Crucis claimed victory without speaking. They simply waited for her body to finish what they had begun in secret. The stench of blood clung to her chambers. The midwives crossed themselves. Own ladies refused to meet her eyes. Anne lay beneath heavy furs, muttering names in her fever. Henry, Elizabeth, George. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes she screamed. At night, she swore she saw robed figures at the foot of her bed, their faces hidden, their hands dripping water that sizzled on her skin. She refused confession. She refused comfort. She whispered, "They are watching me." And they were. Her physician reported every symptom. Her priest noted every prayer. Her enemies, cloaked in concern, visited her bedside with faces carved from stone. She knew the script. When a queen loses blood, she loses favor. When she loses favor, her body becomes evidence of Venice that she was never chosen, never pure, never rightful. Henry did not visit. Instead, he rode to hunt, and Anne bled each drop a verdict. Her mind began to fray. She wrote letters that made no sense. She demanded her daughter be brought to her, then screamed when the child entered. She saw faces in mirrors, heard chanting in empty rooms. She accused the walls of moving. Hand still, the blood came. Was this madness? Or was it the weight of a curse placed upon her by men who had already written her end? The court, once held by her voice, now held its breath. Nobles distanced themselves. Ambassadors sent reports. Cromwell sharpened his strategy, and in the crypts beneath St. Peter at Vincula, the cult lit candles. They carved her name into stone, not to honor, but to bind, to seal, to complete the ritual of her fall. Anne was not killed by sword, not yet. She was killed by drain, by the slow leaking of hope from her veins, by a body that broke beneath the pressure of prophecy, by a court that watched her collapse and said, "It is God's will." But in truth, it was theirs. They had made her bleed, and now they would make her disappear. The morning was still. No birds, no bells, It's just the muffled sound of boots on stone and the creak of wood being tested beneath weight. Anne rose early, not because she was rested, but because she could not sleep. She had not slept in days, not since the verdict. Her cell in the tower was small, but not cruel. A gift, they said. One last grace from the king she had once commanded. She dressed in gray, the color of ash, hair tucked beneath the linen coif. Her fingers, once adorned with rings of power, were bare. She had asked for one thing only, that the sword be French, sharp, swift, merciful, a strange request for a queen who had become England's most bitter prayer. Outside, the scaffold waited. It was clean, draped in cloth, arranged like a stage, because death in the Tudor court was not merely punishment. It was performance. The crowd gathered slowly, as if drawn not by duty, but by dread. Nobles in fur, servants in rags, soldiers with eyes too young to understand what they were guarding. Somewhere near the back, it is said, the Custodes Crucis stood cloaked in shadow, lips moving in silent chant, and ascended the steps like a woman who had already left her body behind, lightly, quietly, as if each footfall whispered, "I forgive you." She looked out at the faces, unreadable and still. Her voice, when it came, was soft, measured, final. "I die the king's good servant, and God's first." No bitterness, no accusation, just a chill of grace. She knelt, not for the crowd, not for the sword, but, perhaps, for herself, a final act of agency in a life where everything had been claimed: her body, her child, her truth. The executioner stepped forward. He held no axe, only a sword, glinting pale silver in the morning haze. He whispered to his assistant, asking for a blindfold. Anne declined. She wanted to see the sky. The crowd held its breath, and in that silence, faster than prayer, quieter than breath, the sword flashed. Her head fell, landing softly in the basket lined with white lilies. They say for a moment the petals remained white. Then the blood soaked in, turning them red, as if the flowers themselves had blushed with guilt. Did she die for adultery, for ambition, for heresy? Or did she die because she no longer served the story the court needed to tell? The body was removed quickly. The crowd dispersed. The scaffold was wiped clean before sunset. History would write that she died with dignity, that the law had spoken, that order had been restored. But the Tau remembers. The wind still carries her last breath down its corridors, and the lilies, they never grew there again. There was no morning procession, no tolling bell, no morning veil upon the city. Anne Boleyn, once crowned Queen of England with a thunderous ceremony of golden song, was buried in silence. A hole was dug in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, small, shallow, and unmarked. The box that carried her broken body was not carved from royal oak, but a reused arrow, just splintered, crude, still stained from war. It fit her awkwardly. They folded her limbs inside like unwanted linen. No priest offered a eulogy. No choir sang. No noble wept publicly. Her grave was filled in haste, and the earth patted down by hands that would not meet each other's gaze. And just like that, the Queen of England vanished not in spectacle, but in erasure. The court did not speak her name. Her portraits were removed or painted over. Her initials scratched off palace stonework. A crest, once the crowned falcon atop a golden rosplus, torn from tapestries and melted with old candle wax. Elizabeth, her daughter, was declared illegitimate. Her friends were imprisoned, her brother executed. Her lineage, a line that would one day rule an empire, was reduced to whispers and shame. History was rewritten in real time. Cromwell's scribes inked new truths. Ambassadors were told to report that the king had been deceived by a sorceress. The common people were fed tales of incest and devilry, and the Custodes Crucis, tucked once more into the shadows of cathedral crypts, knew they had succeeded, not because they had killed a queen, but because they had removed a symbol. They hadn't just ended her life, they had ended her meaning. But the silence was never complete. The tower guards spoke of strange dreams. A woman in gray, walking barefoot through the yard at midnight, always looking upward as if searching for the stars she once reached for. The chapel where she lay grew colder than the rest of the grounds. Candles snuffed themselves out when prayers were said too loud. The scent of lilies lingered long past their season, and some still remembered. A maid who had once dressed her kept a lock of hair, wrapped in silk, hidden in her bodice. A poet left a verse carved into the base of a garden statue. She died a queen without a kingdom, and a woman without a world. But in official history, Anne Boleyn was a lesson, a warning, heretic, cautionary tale for ambitious women and faithless wives. Was it justice or shame wrapped in scripture? They buried her in silence, not because she deserved silence, but because they feared what her voice would say. It lived, and so the earth closed over her. But the story did not, because the story, like the queen, refused to stay dead. They thought she would be forgotten. They thought time would scatter her name like dust through the corridors of power. Cool, but Anne Boleyn did not vanish. She transformed. Her flesh may have rotted beneath stone, her titles stripped, her memory smeared with scandal, but blood remembers what ink tries to erase. Her daughter, Elizabeth, survived, illegitimate, bastard, a child cursed with a mother's executioner at her back and a father's silence at her front. Yet she endured, and more than endured, she ascended. Years later, when she took the throne, the child born in disgrace became the Virgin Queen, the sovereign of Golden Age. And in her eyes, they said, were Anne's, sharp, knowing, defiant Anne's. Blood sat on a throne, ruling over the very men who had sworn she would never be queen. That was her vengeance, not fire, not blade, but continuation. Her legacy, like her life, was not meek, it was not delicate. It was fire through the bloodstream of England. A reminder that symbols, once broken, do not disappear, they multiply. Every woman who wrote in the margins of a banned book, every girl who whispered her own name with power, every monarch who ruled without a king, they carry her echo. What is the price of transformation? Must every woman who changes history first be crucified upon it? Custodes Crucis vanished, their names purged, their relics lost, but their fingerprints remained on the laws that silenced, the rituals that punished, the fears that lingered in pews and palace alike. They killed Anne because they feared her, and they feared her because she reminded them of something bearable, that a woman could wield power without asking. Anne Boleyn was not perfect. She was not a saint. She was proud, cunning, impatient, ambitious. But she was alive in a way that terrified dead institutions, and so they murdered her. But in doing so, they gave birth to a legend, one forged not in grace, but in flame. When Elizabeth ruled, she never spoke much of her mother, but she wore her colors. She ruled unmarried. She wielded charm like a sword. And when asked where her authority came from, she once pointed to her own body and said, "It is enough." 2 was Anne. So what do we learn from her legacy? That crowns are not always placed, they are fought for. That power does not ask for permission. That sometimes the blood spilled at the foundation of a nation becomes the very force that holds it together. Anne Boleyn's body was buried without honor, but her legacy was born wearing a crown. They were never officially named. No edicts condemned them. No histories recorded their rituals. but they moved beneath the stones of England's most powerful palaces in a visible order with visible intent. The Custodes Crucis, the keepers of the cross, not sanctioned by pope or king, yet more loyal than both. Kana, they saw themselves not as traitors, but as the final guardians of God's will in a world unraveling into heresy. They had waded through the collapse of papal authority. They had watched as monasteries fell, crucifixes were torn from altars, Latin faded from liturgy, and they blamed one woman, not Henry, not Cromwell, not the hungry new clerics drunk on reform. Anne Boleyn died to them. She was the serpent in the garden, the queen whose very womb desecrated tradition, the enchantress who whispered England away from the true church. And so they formed it as soldiers, but as shadows. They did not declare war, they declared silence. Their power was an erasure and suggestion. Inwrought, masked as piety, the members were many and varied daging knights, clinging to a vanished code. Bishops stripped of Rome's protection, disillusioned monks, royal servants, who had once poured wine for the Pope's envoys. They met in crypts, in hollowed-out chapels, in ink-smudged margins of forgotten ledgers. Their weapons were not swords, but suspicion, slipped letters, paid confessions, carefully curated dread. After Anne's execution, they vanished again, not in shame, but in satisfaction, their mission complete. The queen had been cleansed, the cross, they believed, had been defended, and yet their influence didn't end with her blood. Some say they whispered into Mary Tudor's ear, encouraging the pyres that lit Smithfield. Others claim a later echo of their creeds stirred the minds behind the gunpowder plot, that the Custodes never truly died, only shed names, reborn in every age where fear disguised itself as faith. What happens when a cult no longer needs a meeting, place only an idea? Perhaps that is why they are forgotten, not because they failed, but because they succeeded so well. History dared not admit they ever existed, and the silence that followed was their most enduring masterpiece. She has been called many things: a seductress, a sorceress, heretic, a martyr, a queen. But Anne Boleyn was never allowed to be just a woman. Spree split her in two between the scandal and the silence, between the sinner they burned and the mother they buried to her enemies. She was the death of holiness, the foreign whore who bewitched a king and dismantled the sanctity of Rome with a smirk. They painted her as Eve with a French accent and a crucifix turned upside down, an omen of the English soul unraveling. To them, her execution was not murder, it was restoration. But to others, to the ones who dared look beyond the smoke and crown, she was something else. A woman who spoke Latin better than the bishops who condemned her, who debated scripture, wrote poetry, and pushed for the English Bible in every church pew. A woman who gave alms in secret and argued for the education of girls. A woman who dared to hold the king's gaze without trembling and refused to lie. Still for power, Todd. Was she a heretic? Or a prophet undone by the hands of those she challenged? Letters of Ethan, faded, trembling with the final days of her breath. She wrote not of vengeance, but of hope, of her daughter's future, of her own innocence, and of God not as a sword-wielding judge, but as a witness to her pain, a witness to her truth. In one of her final prayers, she asked not for life, but for clarity, that the world might one day see her not as the court painted her, but as she truly was, not perfect, but real. Anne Boleyn was no saint, but sainthood has always been too small a box for women who aren't brighter than the men who fear them. Her crime was not adultery, it was power. The power to shape a kingdom with her tongue, her womb, her mind. The power to inspire, the power to survive and story even when her body was ground beneath stone. So what was Anne? Perhaps she was both the heretic they feared and the saint we still seek. Stone does not forget, neither does the tower. Centuries have passed since Anne Boleyn's head fell into a basket and her name into disgrace. Yet her presence lingers like perfume after fire. Guards report strange winds that pass through locked gates. Visitors feel sudden chills in summer heat. And some those who dare to wait in the quiet say they see her, not in dream, not in madness, but as shadow, as sorrow. A woman in white walking the grounds where no footsteps sound, barefoot, head bowed, hands folded, except she has no face, no eyes, no mouth, because they say she walks not to be seen, not to see, to look for something she never found, justice, perhaps, or peace. She is most often seen near the chapel, where her bones were buried without prayer, or near the scaffold, where lilies no longer grow, always silent, always alone. Her presence does not scream, it reminds that something once happened here which no executioner's blade could truly end. They say on the anniversary of her death, the tower changes, the air thickens, birds avoid the skies above, candles blow out without wind, and the ravens, who never leave the grounds, fall still watching the chapel door. Some claim she searches for her daughter. Never knowing Elizabeth lived, this believes she's looking for the ring Henry took from her hand, or for the sword, tore for her name carved. Somewhere it was never allowed to remain. But maybe she is not searching at all. Maybe she walks not because she is lost, but because we are. Because history forgets to Weasley. Because justice buries the inconvenient. Because queens, once broken, are too quickly silenced. What becomes of truth when it is buried without a marker? The tower whispers her name not as warning, but as confession. Because even stone knows Anne Boleyn was not finished, only interrupted. The fire did not begin with Anne, nor did it end with her. Smoldered beneath every altar, every throne, every law that claimed the divine while breaking the human. Anne Boleyn did not die because she was guilty. She died because power, when it trembles, must be reassured with blood. And faith, when it fears, feeds the flames. They said she was dangerous, not because she plotted, but because she spoke. Not because she sent, but because she thought. Not because she failed, but because she dared. And so they took her voice, her body, her breath, and offered it to the altar of order. Because in a world ruled by men who confuse silence with holiness, a woman like Anne is blasphemy. She did not scream on the scaffold. She knelt, calm, controlled, dignified, and in doing so, she stole their spectacle. She denied them fear. That was her final rebellion, not survival, but serenity. A refusal to be broken in spirit, even when the sword found her neck. How many women must be burned, buried, or erased before the world believes them human? The court went on. The king remarried. The laws shifted. The crowns passed. And yet, the blood Anne spilled never dried. It soaked into the stone of the tower, into the soul of a daughter who would one day rise, not in spite of her mother's death, but because of it. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years. She never married, never bowed. She carried the legacy, not just of monarchy, but of a woman undone by its rules. And in her rule, Anne returned, not in name, but in strength. Not as a ghost, but as an idea that a woman can command, not with seduction or scandal, but with sovereignty. The Custodes Crucis, the cult that plotted Anne's fall, were never unmasked. Their names lost, their cause faded, but their legacy lives on in every system that punishes defiance, every ritual that uses righteousness to mask fear. They thought they were saving England's soul, but in truth, they only revealed its sickness. Was it God they subdued the comfort of control. When we burn a woman for power, we call it politics. When we silence her for being too clever, we call it caution. Hate, when we forget her, we call it history. But Anne Boleyn is not forgotten. She walks still in the minds of the defiant, the unloved, the underestimated, in the breath of every girl taught to whisper when she should have roared, in the shadow of every throne built too high for truth to reach. Her life was short. Her reign was brief. Her death was public. But her story is eternal.